Imagine walking alone down a deserted road, the Halloween night closing in around you. Each step echoes, and in the distance, figures emerge from the darkness, a sinister clown, a strange man with a baby carriage, and a party in a cave that feels wrong. Could you escape, or would the night swallow you whole? Tonight, you'll face 3 terrifying encounters, each darker than the last, all unfolding on the most chilling night of the year, Halloween. Get ready for suspense, scares, and twists that will make your heart race. If you love stories that leave you on edge, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with your friends so they can experience the terror too. And let me know in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? Haunted hunting memory. It was a Halloween night that had etched itself into Diogo's memory, a night that still made his skin crawl whenever he dared to think about it. He had been only 10 years old at the time, living in a small village near Coimbra, Portugal. The village was surrounded by dense woods that the locals called Mata dos Esquecidos, the Forgotten Forest. People whispered about strange happenings in the forest, but no one ever dared to explain what they really meant. It was just one of those things people avoided talking about, as though ignoring it would keep the darkness at bay. On that particular Halloween, Diogo, along with his friends, João, Tomás, and Sarah, had decided they were old enough to explore the woods at night. Dressed in their costumes, they stood at the edge of the forest, where the street lamps faded, casting long shadows that stretched into the darkness. The wind whistled through the tall pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Diogo, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear, glanced over at João, who had a mischievous grin plastered on his face. João, the oldest of the group and always the boldest, was the one who had convinced them all to venture beyond the safety of their small village. "This will be fun," João said, his voice full of bravado, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "They say Mata dos Esquecidos is haunted, but that's just an old wives' tale. We'll find something cool, maybe even get some more candy." Sarah, holding her flashlight tightly, shivered slightly in the crisp autumn air. "I don't know, João. My grandmother always warned me about this forest. She said people who went and sometimes never came back, or came back different." Tomás, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "Come on, Sarah. You don't really believe that, do you? It's just a story to scare kids. Besides, we've got flashlights, right?" He waved his light around, illuminating the gnarled trunks of the trees that lined the path. Still, Sarah's unease was contagious, and Diogo felt a knot tightening in his stomach as they stepped beyond the last flickering streetlight, plunging into the shadows of the forest. The sounds of their village quickly faded behind them, the distant laughter of children trick-or-treating, the faint crackle of fireworks in the air. Ahead of them, the forest seemed to swallow every sound, leaving only the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. For a while, it was just them and the forest. The flashlight beams darted between the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. They joked nervously, trying to lighten the mood. João led the way, his eyes scanning the path ahead as if daring something to jump out and scare them. But after about 20 minutes, the laughter started to fade, and the chill in the air seemed to deepen. Diogo felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The forest had changed. The trees seemed to press in closer, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes in the dim light. And then, just up ahead, they saw something that made them all stop in their tracks. A man stood in the middle of the path. He was hunched over slightly, as though something weighed him down, and he was pushing an old, rusted baby carriage. Diogo's first thought was that it had to be a Halloween prank, someone from the village trying to scare them. But the longer he stared, the more he realized something was off. The man's clothes were tattered, almost as if they were falling apart. He wore a wide-brimmed straw hat that covered most of his face, but what little they could see of him was unnerving. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and his shoulders sagged as if the very air around him was too heavy to bear. "João, always the bravest, or the most reckless, took a step forward. "Hey, senor," he called out, his voice cracking slightly despite his attempt at confidence. "What are you doing out here with that thing?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, revealing a face that seemed to belong to someone long dead. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and his lips were cracked and dry, yet they twisted into a smile that sent a wave of dread through Diogo. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that promised something sinister. "Trick or treat," the man rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper carried by the wind. He held up a small, crumpled bag of candy, offering it to them. João hesitated, glancing back at the others, but before he could say anything, Sarah let out a small gasp. Her flashlight had caught something inside the baby carriage, a doll. But it wasn't like any doll they'd ever seen. Its face was cracked, one eye missing entirely, and the other dangled by a thread. Its limbs were contorted in ways that didn't seem natural, and its mouth was sewn shut with thick, black thread. Diogo felt his heart leap into his throat. We should go," he whispered, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her back. But João, ever the stubborn one, stood his ground. "It's just a doll," he muttered, though there was an edge to his voice now. "It's just part of his costume, right?" The man's smile widened, his head tilting to the side as he took a step forward, pushing the creaky carriage toward them. "Take the candy," he whispered again, his voice low and unnerving. The forest seemed to grow colder, the trees creaking ominously as a gust of wind howled through the branches. Diogo could feel the weight of the man's gaze, those hollow eyes boring into them, as if daring them to make a move. His legs felt like lead, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something about the man, the way he moved, the way the carriage squeaked as it rolled closer, kept him frozen in place. Then, without warning, the flashlight beams began to flicker. Once. Twice. And then, in unison, they all went out. They were plunged into darkness. For a few moments, the world was silent. Then, through the blackness, Diogo heard it, the slow, deliberate creaking of the baby carriage wheels, moving closer and closer. Diogo's breath caught in his throat as the darkness swallowed them. The faint rustling of leaves and the slow, rhythmic squeak of the carriage wheels seemed to echo all around, as if the forest itself was amplifying the sound. His heart hammered against his chest, the cold air burning in his lungs as he struggled to steady his breathing. He could hear Sarah next to him, her own breaths coming in rapid, terrified gasps. "João?" Diogo whispered, his voice trembling. But there was no answer. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that pressed in from all sides. Diogo blinked rapidly, trying to adjust his eyes to the pitch-black surroundings, but it was useless. The only thing he could focus on was the creak of the carriage, growing louder with each passing second. And then, without warning, João's voice pierced the silence. "Run!" João shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Diogo heard the crunch of leaves as João took off into the woods, his footsteps fading into the distance. Diogo's instincts screamed at him to follow, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't think. All he could hear was the creaking of the carriage, now impossibly close. It was as if the sound was circling them, though Diogo hadn't heard the man move at all. "Diogo, please!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, trembling and raw with fear. Suddenly, something brushed against Diogo's leg. He flinched, his body jolting with terror, but when he reached down, he realized it was Sarah's hand, gripping his pant leg tightly. She was trembling. He could feel her panic radiating through the darkness. "We have to go," Sarah whimpered, her voice almost swallowed by the wind that howled through the trees. "We have to go now." Diogo nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. They stumbled through the darkness, their feet tripping over roots and fallen branches, the forest floor unforgiving beneath them. But no matter how fast they ran, the sound of the carriage seemed to follow them, that infernal, grinding squeak, like metal scraping against metal. It was relentless, as though the man was always just a step behind them, just out of sight. They ran for what felt like hours, the forest becoming an endless maze of shadows and twisted branches. Diogo's legs burned with exhaustion, his chest tight from the cold air and the panic that gnawed at his insides. He had no idea where João or Tomás were, only that they had scattered into the woods, driven by the same overwhelming fear that gripped him. "Sarah, keep up!" Diogo gasped, his hand gripping hers tightly as they pushed through the thick underbrush. But suddenly, her hand slipped from his grasp. "Sarah?" Diogo stopped, his heart racing as he spun around, desperately scanning the darkness. "Sarah?" There was no answer. Diogo's pulse pounded in his ears as he frantically searched for any sign of her. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky, but there was no sign of Sarah. No sound, no movement. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. "Sarah!" Diogo shouted, his voice cracking. Panic surged through him, icy fingers wrapping around his throat. He was alone. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and thick. And then, in the distance, he heard it again, that sickening creak of the baby carriage. He turned to run, his legs shaking with fear, but before he could take another step, a figure stepped out from behind the trees. It was the man. Diogo froze, his breath catching in his throat. The man stood only a few feet away, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows, but Diogo could see the gleam of his eyes in the dim light. The man's head tilted slightly, as if he were studying Diogo, amused by his terror. The creaking carriage stood beside the man, half hidden in the darkness, but Diogo could just make out the twisted form of the doll inside. Its broken, cracked face stared blankly up at the sky, its hollow eyes reflecting the faintest glimmer of moonlight that managed to filter through the dense canopy of trees. For a long, terrifying moment, the two of them stood there in the silence, the man's cold, unblinking eyes fixed on Diogo. Then, slowly, the man's lips parted into that same unsettling smile, too wide, too unnatural. His voice, soft and hoarse, cut through the air like a whisper on the wind. "Take the candy, boy." Diogo felt his stomach twist, a wave of nausea rolling over him. His mind screamed for him to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs were frozen, rooted to the ground as if the forest itself had wrapped him in its grip. The man's hand reached into the carriage, pulling out another crumpled, greasy bag of candy. His bony fingers extended toward Diogo, the candy clutched between them like an offering from the grave. The sight of the man's hand, pale, skeletal, with nails that looked like they had been gnawed to the quick, sent a fresh wave of terror through Diogo. And then, from behind him, a branch snapped. Diogo whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, just a few feet away, was Tomás, panting heavily, his flashlight clutched in his shaking hand. The beam flickered weakly, but it was enough to cut through the darkness. "We have to go," Tomás gasped, his voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. "Diogo, we have to get out of here. Now." But Diogo couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the man, still standing there, still smiling. The man's eyes gleamed with something dark, something unnatural. And then, slowly, he began to push the carriage forward again. Creak! Creak! The sound of the wheels grinding against the earth sent a shudder down Diogo's spine. He didn't wait for another second. Grabbing Tomás's arm, he ran. They bolted through the trees, not caring where they were going, only that they had to get away. But even as they ran, Diogo could still hear it, the steady, relentless creak of the carriage wheels, following them through the forest like a ghost that refused to be left behind. Diogo's legs burned as they sprinted through the dense forest, weaving between trees and stumbling over roots that seemed to reach up and grab at their ankles. Tomas's breathing was ragged beside him, each gasp sounding like a desperate plea. The flashlight in Tomas's hand swung wildly, casting erratic beams of light that only served to make the shadows around them dance like mocking phantoms. But the worst part was the sound. That horrible, grating squeak of the carriage wheels grinding through the dirt was still behind them, unwavering and unyielding. No matter how fast they ran, it was always there, like a sinister metronome, ticking down the moments until the darkness caught up with them. "Tomas, where's Joao?" Diogo gasped, his voice raw from the cold air tearing at his throat. Tomas shook his head frantically. I don't know. He ran off. I thought he was with you." Panic surged through Diogo. Joao was the bravest of them, the one who had led them into this mess, but now he was gone, swallowed by the forest. And Sarah, Diogo's heart twisted painfully at the thought of her. He had lost her too. How could he have let go of her hand? The guilt gnawed at him, even as every instinct screamed for him to keep running, to just survive. Branches clawed at their clothes, scratching at their faces as they pushed deeper into the forest. Diogo could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back, soaking his costume. The world around them was a blur of black and gray, the trees stretching into twisted shapes that loomed over them like specters. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the forest itself were trying to drag them down. Then, suddenly, Tomas tripped. "Tomas!" Diogo cried out, skidding to a stop as his friend went sprawling onto the ground. Tomas's flashlight flew from his grasp, rolling a few feet away and casting a dim, wavering beam across the forest floor. Tomas groaned, clutching his ankle. I can't move. My leg." Diogo's heart pounded wildly. He glanced behind them, his blood running cold. The darkness seemed thicker there, a black wall that pressed in closer with each second. And then he saw it, a faint, glimmering reflection. Eyes. Watching them from the shadows. "Get up, Tomas, please." Diogo's voice was frantic, but Tomas shook his head, his face twisted in pain. "I can't. Diogo, I can't." Tomas whimpered, his eyes wide with fear. The carriage's creak was louder now, impossibly close. Diogo grabbed Tomas's arm, hauling him up with all the strength he could muster. "Come on, we have to move," he begged, desperation clawing at his throat. But Tomas was too heavy, and Diogo's own legs felt like they would give out at any moment. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Diogo saw something move. The man stepped out from behind a tree, his figure barely visible in the dim glow of the fallen flashlight. He was smiling again, that same wide, unnatural grin that stretched across his face like a grotesque mask. The carriage creaked forward slowly, its rusted wheels dragging through the dirt as the man pushed it closer. "Take the candy," the man whispered, his voice carrying through the still air. Diogo stared, frozen in place. There, in the carriage, was the doll, its head now turned to face them. The empty sockets where its eyes should have been seen to gaze straight into Diogo's soul, and its sewn-shut mouth twisted in a mockery of a smile. And then, to Diogo's horror, the doll moved. Its tiny, mangled hand twitched, the fingers curling slightly as if beckoning them closer. Diogo's stomach churned, a wave of nausea washing over him. It was impossible. It had to be a trick. But every nerve in his body screamed that what he was seeing was real. The man took another step forward, his gaze locked on Diogo. "Take the candy," he repeated, his voice low and insistent. Tomas whimpered beside Diogo, his eyes wide with terror. What does he want?" Diogo didn't know. He didn't want to know. All he knew was that they had to get out, had to escape before. "Diogo, over here!" A voice called out from the darkness. Diogo's head snapped up, his heart leaping in his chest. Joao. It was Joao's voice. "Joao!" Diogo shouted, hope flaring inside him. He turned toward the sound, squinting through the gloom. There, a few meters away, Joao stood, his flashlight pointed directly at them. "Come on, run!" Joao yelled, his voice urgent. Diogo didn't hesitate. Ignoring the pain in his legs, he grabbed Tomas under the arm and pulled him to his feet. Together, they staggered toward Joao, each step a struggle against the crushing weight of fear. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching them with those hollow eyes, his smile never wavering. But the doll. Diogo could have sworn he saw it lift its head, those empty sockets still fixed on him as they ran. They reached Joao, panting and trembling. Joao's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was relief there too. "Are you okay?" "Where's Sarah?" he asked breathlessly. Diogo shook his head, unable to speak. His throat felt tight, the words lodged somewhere deep inside him. He didn't know where Sarah was. All he knew was that they couldn't go back. Not ever. "Let's go," Joao urged, glancing over his shoulder. "We have to get out of here." The three of them ran, pushing through the thick undergrowth, the forest seeming to claw at them with every step. Diogo's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What had they seen? What was that thing? Finally, they broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the narrow road that led back to their village. They collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, the cold night air biting at their skin. For a long time, none of them spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees and their own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, Diogo turned back toward the forest. The darkness loomed there, deep and impenetrable, but he saw no sign of the man. No creaking carriage. No doll. But he knew. He knew it was still out there, watching. "We can't tell anyone," Joao said quietly, his voice trembling. "No one would believe us." Diogo nodded slowly. He knew Joao was right. Who would believe them? A ghostly man, a haunted carriage, a doll that moved on its own? It sounded insane. And yet, it was real. The memory of that smile, those hollow eyes, would haunt him forever. As they turned and began the long walk back to the village, Diogo couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them. A presence in the darkness, just out of sight. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the faint creak of a carriage wheel echoed through the trees. Encounter with the clown. The autumn air was thick with the smell of burning leaves and wood smoke, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes long after the fire had burned out. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack as he walked down the long, empty road that led to the campground. It was Halloween, and the streets had been filled with trick-or-treaters just hours earlier. Now, the night was eerily quiet, and only the occasional rustling of leaves disturbed the stillness. Ethan's dad had gone ahead to the campsite earlier in the evening to set up their tent. The plan was simple: Ethan would join him after Halloween festivities in town, and in the morning, they'd spend the day hunting in the nearby woods. It was supposed to be a special father-son weekend, something they hadn't done in years. Ethan wasn't much of a hunter, but his dad loved it, and after all the fights and distance between them lately, he figured this would be a chance to reconnect. The road was long and straight, lined with tall trees that created a tunnel of darkness ahead of him. His flashlight cut through the blackness in front, casting long, thin shadows that danced across the ground. A cool breeze swept through the trees, sending a chill down his spine, but Ethan kept walking. He had only a few more miles to go before reaching the campground. As he walked, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his gut. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that his phone had lost signal hours ago, but something about the night felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. Then he saw him. Just up ahead, standing by the side of the road, was a man. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe one of the town's Halloween decorations, but as he drew closer, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a clown. The man wore a tattered, dirty clown costume. The bright colors, red, yellow, and blue, were faded and smeared with what looked like mud. His face was painted white with exaggerated red lips that curled into a grotesque grin, and his eyes were ringed with dark, smudged circles. The clown's hair, a wild, unkempt mass of orange, stuck out in all directions. In one hand, he held a cluster of deflated balloons that dangled limply by his side. Ethan's steps slowed, his pulse quickening as he tried to process what he was seeing. His first thought was that it was just some leftover Halloween prank. Maybe one of the locals having fun, trying to scare the last few stragglers making their way through town. But this far out of town? In the middle of nowhere? The clown didn't move as Ethan approached, just stood there, staring. Ethan felt his stomach churn with unease. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and kept walking, keeping a wide berth as he passed. As he drew near, the clown's eyes, wide and painted with exaggerated black rings, locked onto his. Ethan could feel the gaze burning into him, even though the clown didn't move or speak. "Nice costume," Ethan muttered, more to break the silence than anything else. His voice sounded thin and shaky in the still night. The clown didn't respond. Ethan quickened his pace, trying to put distance between himself and the figure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the clown's eyes were still on him, even after he had passed. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the shadows darker. His heart thudded in his chest, and he resisted the urge to look back. "Don't turn around," he told himself. "Just keep walking." But the longer he walked, the stronger the urge became. Something gnawed at the back of his mind, a whisper of panic that told him to look, to make sure the clown wasn't following him. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Ethan glanced over his shoulder. The clown was standing in the middle of the road, no more than 10 feet behind him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard a sound, no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, but the clown was closer, much closer than he had been. His grotesque grin stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes gleamed with something dark, something predatory. A wave of fear surged through Ethan, sending icy tendrils of dread snaking down his spine. He whipped his head forward and quickened his pace, his heart hammering in his chest. He told himself not to run. Running would only make it worse. But every instinct screamed at him to flee, to get as far away from that clown as possible. For a few minutes, Ethan kept his pace steady, focusing on the road ahead, forcing himself not to look back. His legs ached, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts, but he kept going. The campground couldn't be far now. Then he heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Almost like footsteps. Ethan's blood ran cold. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to know how close the clown was now. But the footsteps grew louder, unmistakable, shuffling in the darkness behind him. He couldn't take it anymore. His heart pounding in his throat, Ethan turned. The clown was running toward him. The balloons trailed behind him like dead weight as his legs pumped furiously, his shoes slapping against the pavement. His painted smile was now grotesquely exaggerated, his lips stretched wide as though they might split apart. The deflated balloons fluttered behind him like limp, blackened tendrils. Panic gripped Ethan's chest like a vice. Without thinking, he broke into a sprint, his feet pounding against the asphalt as he ran as fast as he could. His flashlight beam bobbed wildly in front of him, illuminating the road in erratic bursts. The clown's footsteps pounded in rhythm with his own, getting closer, closer. Ethan could hear the ragged breathing behind him now, each breath like a rasping hiss, and the occasional high-pitched giggle, faint and chilling. He ran harder, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for him to stop, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. He had to get away. The road stretched on, endless, the trees blurring as he sprinted. He didn't dare look back again. He couldn't face the sight of that grinning, painted face chasing him down in the dark. Finally, up ahead, he saw it, the faint glow of the campground lights through the trees. Safety. His father. Summoning every last bit of strength, Ethan bolted toward the lights, his vision swimming from exhaustion. He could feel the clown behind him, so close he could almost sense the cold breath on the back of his neck. But just as he reached the edge of the campground, the footsteps stopped. Ethan stumbled forward, his legs nearly giving out as he reached the clearing. He whipped around, flashlight trembling in his hand. The road behind him was empty. The clown was gone. But the echo of that high-pitched giggle lingered in the air, soft and menacing, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole. Ethan stood at the edge of the campground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart still thundering in his chest. His flashlight trembled in his hand, its beam flickering weakly as he scanned the road behind him. Nothing. The clown was gone, but the unease that clung to him like a cold sweat refused to fade. For a long moment, he just stood there, frozen, half expecting the figure to reappear from the shadows. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze and the soft hum of crickets in the woods. But that eerie giggle still echoed in his mind, faint and sinister. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the panic. He couldn't stand here forever. He had to find his dad. He forced his legs to move, crossing the small clearing that led into the campground. The orange glow of the campfire was visible now, flickering between the trees. The familiar sight brought him a sliver of relief, and he quickened his pace, eager to be by his father's side. When he reached the clearing, he saw his father sitting by the fire, stirring a pot of soup hanging over the flames. His dad, Robert, looked up and smiled as Ethan approached, clearly unaware of the terror his son had just endured. "There you are," Robert said, his voice warm but gruff. "I was starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost on your way here." Ethan collapsed onto one of the logs by the fire, his hands still shaking. He didn't know how to explain what had just happened. His dad would never believe him. A clown chasing him down a deserted road in the middle of the night? It sounded insane, even to Ethan. "You okay, bud?" Robert asked, noticing the look on his son's face. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." "Long walk?" Robert raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He ladled some of the soup into a tin bowl and handed it to Ethan. "Here, eat something. You'll feel better." Ethan took the bowl, but his appetite had vanished. He stirred the soup absent-mindedly, his mind racing. The clown had been real. He was sure of it. The way its eyes had locked onto him, the way it had run after him with that grotesque grin, it wasn't some Halloween prank. It had felt too real, too dangerous. But now, in the safety of the campground, with the warmth of the fire and his father sitting next to him, Ethan's mind began to play tricks. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe his fear had exaggerated things. After all, clowns were common around Halloween, right? Maybe the guy was just some weirdo trying to scare people. That was it. It had to be. Still, the memory of those footsteps and that unsettling laugh gnawed at him, refusing to let go. As the night wore on, Ethan's father began to tell stories, tales of hunting trips and old adventures from when he was younger. Normally, Ethan would have listened, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the clown and the way it had appeared out of nowhere. His eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the campfire, half expecting to see that painted face leering at him from the shadows. Hours passed, and eventually, the fire began to die down. The sky above was clear, the stars twinkling brightly in the cold night air. Ethan's father yawned, stretching as he stood up. "All right, let's hit the sack. We've got a long day tomorrow," Robert said, tossing the last of the firewood onto the dying embers. Ethan nodded, grateful for the excuse to stop pretending everything was normal. He followed his father to the tent, where they both climbed into their sleeping bags. The tent's fabric felt thin and fragile, barely separating them from the vast, dark woods outside. Ethan lay still, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds of the night. His dad's steady breathing soon turned into soft snores, but Ethan couldn't sleep. Every noise outside the tent made his heart race. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps approaching. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep. He had to be imagining things. The clown was long gone. It was just some guy in a costume, and he probably gave up when Ethan reached the campground. But then Ethan heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside the tent. His eyes snapped open, and his breath caught in his throat. It was faint, but clear, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching their campsite. He held his breath, listening intently, hoping it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the footsteps continued, drawing closer with each passing second. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't want to wake his dad, not yet. He needed to be sure. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe another camper passing by. But deep down, he knew. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he was certain whoever was outside could hear it. He squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body tense with fear. He could feel the weight of someone standing just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating them. The silence was unbearable, stretching on for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, the sound of rustling fabric filled the tent as someone, began to trace their fingers along the outside of the tent, dragging their hand across the surface in a slow, deliberate motion. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. He could feel the presence hovering just beyond the walls of the tent, so close he could almost hear the faintest whisper of breath. His eyes darted to his father, who was still fast asleep, oblivious to the terror unfolding outside. The dragging sound continued, circling the tent. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was toying with them, moving slowly, as if savoring the moment. Ethan's mind raced. What should he do? Should he wake his dad? Should they run? The tent felt like a coffin, trapping them inside with no way out. His throat tightened with panic, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep from making any noise. Then, just outside the tent's entrance, he heard it again. A high-pitched giggle. The sound sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, and he felt a scream rising in his throat, but he clamped his mouth shut, forcing himself to stay silent. It was the clown. It had followed him here. The giggle faded, replaced by the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps as the figure began to move away from the tent. For a moment, Ethan didn't dare move. His entire body was trembling with fear, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. The footsteps grew fainter, moving deeper into the woods. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. Ethan lay there, wide-eyed and terrified, staring up at the roof of the tent. He couldn't bring himself to close his eyes, couldn't let his guard down. The clown had followed him all the way out here, to the middle of nowhere. And something told him it wasn't done with him yet. Ethan lay awake, his eyes wide, staring into the darkness of the tent. His breathing was shallow, and his muscles ached from being so tense for so long. The faint sounds of the night outside seemed impossibly loud, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft whisper of the wind. But the sound that haunted him, the sound that played on a loop in his mind, was that giggle. That high-pitched, sinister laugh that had echoed just outside their tent. The clown was still out there. He could feel it. His father's snores were steady, oblivious to the danger that had come so close to them. Ethan's thoughts raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He didn't dare wake his father yet, not when he wasn't sure if the clown had truly left. The last thing he wanted was to open the tent and find that horrifying painted face staring back at him. He had to make sure. Slowly, carefully, Ethan reached for the flashlight beside him. His fingers trembled as he wrapped them around the cold metal, and for a moment, he hesitated. Did he really want to see what was outside? What if the clown was still there, waiting? He didn't have a choice. He needed to know. Holding his breath, Ethan clicked the flashlight on. The beam pierced through the darkness of the tent, casting long shadows on the walls. His heart pounded as he aimed the light toward the entrance. The zipper gleamed in the faint light, undisturbed, and there was no movement outside, just the endless blackness of the woods beyond. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Something still felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He had to be sure. Slowly, he sat up in his sleeping bag, careful not to make a sound. He glanced over at his dad, who was still deep in sleep, his face calm and relaxed in the faint light of the dying campfire outside. Ethan's heart raced as he shifted closer to the tent's entrance. His hands shook as he reached for the zipper, the small metal tab cold against his fingertips. His mind screamed at him to stop, to stay hidden, but his curiosity overpowered his fear. With trembling hands, he began to pull the zipper down, inch by agonizing inch, the sound loud and sharp in the silence. When the zipper was halfway open, he paused, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no giggling. Just the quiet hum of the night. He leaned forward, pushing the tent flap aside, and peered into the clearing outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the trees. The clearing was empty. The road they had walked down earlier stretched out into the darkness, silent and still. For a moment, Ethan almost let himself believe it was over, that the clown was gone. But then he saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, standing half-hidden among the trees, was the clown. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure was motionless, its grotesque grin barely visible in the dim light, but its eyes were fixed on him. Even from this distance, Ethan could feel those eyes boring into him, cold and unblinking. The clown's head tilted slightly, as if amused by Ethan's terror. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears, his body frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to wake his father, to do something, anything. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, his chest tight with fear. Then, without warning, the clown took a step forward. Ethan snapped back to life, jerking away from the tent flap and scrambling backward. His hands fumbled as he yanked the zipper back up, sealing the tent shut as fast as he could. His breathing was rapid, panicked, and he could barely see straight as he turned to shake his father. "Dad! Dad, wake up!" Ethan's voice was a desperate whisper, but Robert barely stirred, his snores breaking rhythm for only a second. Ethan shook him harder, his hands trembling with fear. "Dad, please! There's someone outside." Robert groaned, his eyes slowly fluttering open. "What?" he muttered groggily, rubbing his face. "What's going on, Ethan?" There's someone outside," Ethan stammered, his heart racing. "The clown. It's here." Robert sat up, blinking in confusion. "What clown? What are you talking about?" Ethan's mind raced as he tried to explain. "I saw him on the road when I was walking here. He followed me. He's been outside the tent." Robert frowned, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. "Ethan, you're not making any sense. It's the middle of the night, who would be out here?" But before Ethan could respond, a sound cut through the air, freezing both of them in place. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the fabric of the tent. Tap. 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 The blood drained from Robert's face, his eyes widening as he realized Ethan wasn't imagining things. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on the side of the tent. Ethan's heart nearly stopped as the tapping moved, circling around the tent, as if the clown was toying with them. Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "What the hell?" Suddenly, the tapping stopped. Silence. Then, without warning, the clown's face appeared against the thin fabric of the tent. The outline of its grotesque grin and hollow eyes was pressed up against the material, barely inches from where Ethan and his father sat. The clown's breath, shallow and wheezing, sent the fabric fluttering. "Dad!" Ethan's voice cracked with panic as he scrambled back, his body pressed against the far side of the tent. Robert's eyes were wide with disbelief, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to process what he was seeing. For a moment, he was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the figure looming outside. But then instinct kicked in. "Get your shoes on, now!" Robert barked, grabbing his hunting knife from the side of the tent. His voice was low but commanding, the tone of a man who had faced danger before. "We're getting out of here." Ethan fumbled for his shoes, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie the laces. Outside, the clown moved slowly, dragging its fingers along the surface of the tent with a faint, rasping giggle that made Ethan's skin crawl. As soon as Ethan was ready, Robert motioned for him to stay quiet. He slowly unzipped the other side of the tent, the side farthest from the clown, his knife at the ready. They were going to slip out quietly, make a break for the truck parked at the edge of the campground. If they could just make it to the truck, they'd be safe. Robert glanced at Ethan, his expression serious. "On 3, he whispered. "We run. Don't stop. Got it?" Ethan nodded, his heart racing in his chest. 1, 2, 3. They burst out of the tent and sprinted into the night. Ethan's legs pumped furiously, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His flashlight bounced wildly in his hand, illuminating the path ahead in erratic bursts. Behind them, the clown let out a shrill, blood-curdling laugh. Ethan didn't look back. He couldn't. He focused on the truck, the gleam of the headlights just visible through the trees. His father was ahead of him, running faster than Ethan had ever seen him move, the knife clenched tightly in his hand. The laugh grew louder, closer. They reached the truck, and Robert fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Come on, Ethan begged, glancing over his shoulder. The clown was nowhere to be seen, but the laugh still echoed through the woods, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. Finally, the truck roared to life. Robert threw it into gear, and they sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Ethan looked back one last time, his heart pounding in his chest. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the rearview mirror, stood the clown. Its grin was wide, its eyes gleaming with malevolent glee as it watched them drive away, its figure growing smaller and smaller until it vanished into the darkness. But the laugh followed them, lingering in the air long after they were gone. The haunted Halloween party. The invitation had come unexpectedly, a simple card slipped under Inez's door. Written in swirling, ornate letters was a brief but intriguing message: Halloween party at the Hidden Cavern, 10 p.m. sharp. Costumes required. Come if you dare. The card had no name or contact information, just the time, the location, and the ominous phrase. Inez lived in a small town in northern Portugal, not far from the coastline. Everyone knew about the caves and the cliffs, the ones that jutted out over the crashing waves of the Atlantic. But no one ever went there, especially at night. The caves had a reputation, stories of disappearances, strange noises, and old legends that locals told in hushed whispers around campfires. But there was also a thrill to the unknown, and when Inez showed the invitation to her friends, Marta, Beatrice, and Joanna, they all agreed it was too intriguing to pass up. They dressed in their costumes, Inez as a witch, Marta as a vampire, Beatrice as a black cat, and Joanna as a devil, and made their way down the winding path that led to the cliffs. The cool ocean breeze whipped around them, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that Inez couldn't quite place. "Who do you think invited us?" Joanna asked as they neared the entrance to the caves. Her red devil horns glowed faintly in the moonlight, and she twirled her pitchfork playfully. "No idea," Beatrice replied, her eyes scanning the cliffs. "But this is such a strange place for a party. It's probably some kind of prank, right?" Marta shrugged. Maybe, but whoever it is went through a lot of trouble to make it look real. I mean, look at this place. She gestured toward the entrance of the cave, which was lit by a series of flickering lanterns that cast long, eerie shadows along the jagged rocks. Ines felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about the cave, the way the lanterns barely illuminated the dark interior, the way the wind seemed to carry distant echoes from deep within, that made her uneasy. But her curiosity overpowered her fear. They had come this far, there was no turning back now. Let's check it out, Ines said, taking the lead. The entrance to the cave was wide, the rocky ceiling arching overhead like the gaping mouth of some ancient creature. The further they went, the more the sounds of the ocean faded, replaced by the soft murmur of voices coming from deeper inside. As they rounded a corner, the narrow passage opened up into a vast chamber. It was unlike anything Ines had ever seen. The cavern was enormous, with high ceilings dripping with stalactites that glittered in the dim light. The walls were lined with more lanterns, their flickering flames casting shifting shadows on the wet stone. In the center of the chamber was a long table covered with an array of food and drinks, all seemingly untouched. Around the table, people in costumes milled about, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks. "Wow," Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with surprise. "This is impressive." Marta nodded, glancing around. Whoever organized this went all out. They stepped further into the cavern, taking in the strange scene. The masked figures moved slowly, almost dreamlike, their movements fluid but unnervingly slow. The air inside the cave was thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, a faint, musty odor that made Ines's nose twitch. She looked around, but none of the faces were familiar. It was odd. In such a small town, everyone knew everyone, yet these people were strangers. Joanna frowned, tilting her head toward a tall man standing near the edge of the chamber. His mask was grotesque, a twisted, grinning face with exaggerated features, and his costume looked like something out of an old circus, the fabric torn and stained with what appeared to be dark, rusty blotches. He stood unnaturally still, his eyes hidden behind the mask's hollow sockets, but Ines could feel his gaze on them, following their every move. "Creepy, huh?" Joanna muttered, nudging Ines. "Who do you think that is?" "No clue," Ines replied, her voice quieter than she intended. "But let's not stay near him." They wandered further into the cavern, weaving between the masked partygoers. As they passed the long table, Ines noticed that no one seemed to be eating or drinking. The platters of food were perfectly arranged, untouched, as though they were just for show. "This whole thing feels off," Marta whispered, her eyes scanning the room. "Doesn't it feel like no one is actually here?" Ines nodded, her unease growing. Something was wrong. The masked figures were too quiet, too still. It was as though they were merely shadows, drifting through the cavern without any real substance. She had expected noise, music, laughter, but there was none of that. Only the faint whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of fabric as someone moved. "I think we should go," Beatrice said suddenly, her voice tight with fear. "This doesn't feel right." Ines was about to agree when the tall man from earlier began to walk toward them. His movements were slow and deliberate, his head tilting slightly as if studying them. The grin on his mask seemed to grow wider the closer he came, though Ines knew it was just a trick of the light. "Let's go," she whispered urgently, grabbing Marta's arm. But before they could move, the man spoke, his voice deep and echoing in the vast chamber. "Leaving so soon? The party's just begun." His words sent a chill down Ines's spine. There was something in the way he said it, something that made her blood run cold. The masked figures around them seemed to shift, turning their heads ever so slightly toward the group, their silent gazes falling on Ines and her friends. Joanna took a step back, her face pale beneath her devil horns. "We should have never come here." The man took another step forward, his grin somehow more menacing now. "You were invited, weren't you? The night's just getting started." Ines's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her mind racing. How did he know they wanted to leave? How had they even been invited in the first place? Panic welled up inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We didn't know it would be like this," she stammered. We should go." But the man shook his head slowly. "Once you enter, there's no leaving." Inez's blood ran cold. Behind them, the entrance to the cave suddenly seemed far away, the path they had taken swallowed by the shadows. And then, as if on cue, the masked figures began to move toward them, their steps slow, deliberate, and silent. The masked figures moved in unison, their steps eerily synchronized as they closed in around Inez and her friends. Panic surged through Inez's chest. The cavern, once vast and open, now felt suffocating, the walls seeming to press in as the strange partygoers surrounded them. "We need to go," Marta hissed, gripping Inez's arm tightly. Her voice trembled with fear. The tall man, his grotesque mask still grinning, stood in their path. "No one leaves until the host says so," he said, his voice dripping with malice. His eyes, hidden behind the mask's hollow sockets, gleamed with something dark, something unnatural. Inez's heart pounded as she scanned the chamber, looking for a way out. The entrance was barely visible now, shrouded in shadows and blocked by the advancing crowd. She could hear the soft rustle of their costumes as they moved, their masks all fixed in eerie, silent expressions. Beatrice backed into Joanna, her voice a panicked whisper. "This isn't a party, it's a trap." Suddenly, the tall man raised a hand, and the masked figures stopped. He tilted his head, as if considering them. "The host is watching," he murmured. "He always is." A low, distant rumble echoed through the cave, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. Without warning, the cavern plunged into darkness, the lanterns snuffed out all at once. The only sound was the rapid breathing of Inez and her friends, and the soft shuffle of footsteps moving closer. In the blackness, Inez felt a cold hand brush her shoulder. She froze, her blood turning to ice. And then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "Welcome to the real party." Inez's heart raced in the suffocating darkness. Her breath came in short gasps, her senses heightened as the whispers echoed through the cavern. The touch on her shoulder had been cold, too cold, like something inhuman. She reached out, grabbing Marta's hand, trying to anchor herself in the panic that surged around them. "We need to move." "Now," Inez whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't see anything," Beatrice muttered, her voice trembling. The air was thick with fear, the sound of shuffling feet growing louder, closer. The masked figures were still there, she could feel them circling. Then, a single lantern flickered back to life, illuminating the tall man's grotesque mask. He stood in front of them, grinning wider than before, his hands outstretched as if welcoming them to some twisted celebration. "Join us," he said, his voice a low, sinister drawl. Inez felt Marta's grip tighten. "We need to run," Marta whispered, her voice frantic. But there was no escape. The crowd of masked figures pressed in, their silent gazes locked on the group. The air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Inez glanced desperately toward the cave's entrance, but the shadows were too thick, too impenetrable. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the darkness. "Joanna!" Inez spun around just in time to see her friend being pulled into the crowd, her devil horns disappearing into the sea of masks. "Joanna!" Inez cried out, but it was too late. The cavern swallowed her whole. The tall man's grin stretched even wider. "The host is pleased." Inez's blood turned to ice. And then, the lanterns flickered out again, plunging them back into darkness. And so, the night fades, but the horrors of these encounters may never truly leave. From the chilling chase of a sinister clown to the mysterious man in the woods and the party that seemed more like a trap than a celebration, one thing is certain: Halloween is never just a night of costumes and candy. It's a night where darkness lingers just a bit too close. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more terrifying tales are just waiting to unfold. Share this video with your friends, so they can join you in the chills, and give it a like if you enjoyed the suspense. Let me know in the comments below, which part of the story scared you the most. I can't wait to hear your thoughts.